What's up guys, Excalibur here and welcome back to Star Ocean Anamnesis, as well as another episode of Excal's Explanations. So it's been a while since the last episode, I know, but I said we're going to be talking about the stat screen in the last one, so I guess that's what we're going to be doing. And trusty old Fidel is here to help us out because apparently he is the most important character in the game, seeing as how he is the game's app icon. Regardless, every single character in the game has 6 main stats, with AP being a 7th one technically, so I guess we'll go over these in sequence. First of all, we have the HP stat, which should speak for itself. It determines how many hits a character can take before they die. And then after that, we have the attack stat, which is the stat that you use for all of your physical attacks. And something I should say about physical attacks is this. The way to determine whether an attack is physical or symbology based is by looking at this multiplier right here. If it says attack multiplied by a number, that means that it's a physical attack, thus it goes off of your attack stat. And if it's a symbology attack, it says int multiplied by something. And speaking of int, the int stat determines how much damage you do with your symbology based attacks. Pretty simple, kind of the opposite of the attack stat. And then we have the defense stat, which that one also kind of speaks for itself. That determines how much damage you take from enemy attacks, so the higher the better. And then we have the hit and guard stats, and these two aren't really self-explanatory. So for the hit stat, that determines how much damage you do when an enemy blocks one of your attacks. So in the previous video I told you how to block an attack. Enemies can do the same thing, and this just determines how much damage you do when they block that attack. But more importantly, it also determines how often you score critical hits. So even if you don't have any form of critical hit chance up, you can still get critical hits, and that depends on this hit stat. And if you're wondering how critical hit chance works with the hit stat, it's kind of like a multiplier. So just like how an attack buff multiplies your attack stat, your critical hit chance buff multiplies your hit stat. Or at least it multiplies the chance of doing a critical hit. And then the guard stat is kind of the complete opposite. It determines how much damage you take from an enemy when you're blocking an attack, and it also determines how often enemies can score critical hits on you. And then there's also this, the star rarities. So characters have different rarities, and 3 stars is the lowest, whereas 6 stars is the highest, and obviously that determines how high their stats can go. So 6-star characters usually have the highest stats out of every character in the game. And then we also have limit breaks, and these even further increase the stats of a character. And a character's rarity also determines their level cap. So a 6-star character has a level 70 cap. And one way to increase your stats is by equipping weapons and accessories. So as you can see, these Crimson Fork Tridents have their own attack stat of 849, and the Bunny Hair Clip has its own defense stat. These get added onto your base stats to make them even higher. And the other way to increase them is by going into the status enhancement screen and then selecting one of your characters, and then you can increase their stats with these things called Star Seeds. So if this will ever load, I can show it to you. Star Seeds can be farmed from Crystal Guardian and Frost Tree in the event tab, but here you can see attack, int, HP, and you can put all of these on your character to even further increase their base stat, with limit of course. And another thing that we have in this game are roles, and there are 5 roles in total. You have the attacker role, the defenders, the sharpshooters, the invokers, and the healers. And each one is good at different things. So attackers are usually good when it comes to dishing out damage, and usually when it comes to buffing the attack stat of the entire party. And then we have defenders, who are supposed to draw aggro away from the entire party. They're supposed to be very tanky, and usually all of the top tier defenders are also very powerful DPS wise. And sharpshooters can usually do a variety of different things. Most commonly, they buff damage for the entire party, and they usually buff crits as well. But like I said, they excel at a variety of different things. And then we have the invokers, who are the casting equivalent of attackers. They usually do a lot of damage with their spells, and they buff the int for the entire party. And then lastly, we have the healers, who, as you would guess, heal the entire party. And they can also buff occasionally, like characters like Relia over here. She has an attack buff on one of her attacks, her heal, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, and Raging Fairy Light buffs the attack by 20% for the entire party. So that's like a general outline of what you're supposed to do when you play as a specific class, but another thing that your role determines is how often you draw aggro from the enemy, and just in case you don't know, aggro is basically how often you get targeted by an enemy. So your class or your role determines how often that happens. So as you would guess, defenders get targeted the most out of any class, which makes sense because they're supposed to be the tanky ones. And then sharpshooters are up next. If there's no defender in the party, the sharpshooter is the one that gets targeted by the enemy. And then after that we have the healers, and then the attackers, and lastly the invokers. And there's also a secondary factor that determines how often you get targeted by the enemy, but I'm not really sure what that is. I think it has to do with what weapon you're running and how aggressive you are being towards the boss, because usually if you're playing a defender, you would think that you can keep aggro for pretty much the entire match, but sometimes sharpshooters can easily take it away from you if you're slacking. So yeah, be careful of that. And lastly, I think I'll go over what your base stats should be at. So as you would guess, every single class has different stats that they're good at. So regarding HP, the defenders usually have the highest HP stat, and that makes sense because, like I said, they're the tanky ones. So if we take a look at Rain here, you can see that his HP stat is sitting at 20,000, but then if we take a look at Winter Eve, her HP stat is sitting at a mighty 25,000. So if you're playing a defender, anything above 20,000 is a very good stat line to have for HP. Any other class should be good if their HP is at around 15,000. So 9S over here is sitting at 14,000. That's pretty good. And then for the attack stat, if we're talking about offensive attackers, usually you want their attack stat to be somewhere around 3,200. So Fidel has 3,100, that's very good. Devil Claire has 3,200, so that's also very good. If we're talking about buffing attackers, usually you want their attack stat to be somewhere around 2,800, so that's 3,600 because of the weapon that she's running. But her base stat is, I think, like 27 or 2,800, which is very decent for an attack buffer. And then for defenders and sharpshooters as well, well, defenders usually have something around like 3,000, so Rain is 2,800, that's also good. And sharpshooters, something around 2,800 should also be very good. And then as for the int stat, that actually works in a different way than the attack stat because of how invokers fit into the game. So Mavelle over here has a mighty int stat of 3,800, which is a lot higher than anything you've seen on like an attacker, and she's not even running a weapon here. So that's a base stat of 3,800. Sophia has like a 4,000 base int stat. And if we're talking about invokers, something above 3,600, like around 3,600 should be good for them. Anything below 3,200, I would say, is just way too low for an invoker, unless they have like superb party buffing, which not many do. So anything above 3,600 or around there should be good. And technically those are the only stats that actually matter a lot. Defense should always be like above 2,000 and then you're fine. Most defenders are sitting at like 2,500 or above. I've seen A2 at like 2,900, I think. So that's very high, but anything above 2,000 for defense should be good. And hit stat and guard stat, usually characters have that around like 1,000. Guard is usually 800 and hit is like 1,000 or higher, but like I said, those don't really matter. And I guess that about covers everything that I wanted to do in this episode of my explanation series. So up next, I think we'll go over buff stacking and talents and weapon factors and all that good stuff. So if you want to know about that, stay tuned, and I guess I will see you all next time. Peace!